Welcome to the last panel, the long Soviet shadow and post-imperial legacies, the last but not the least. So I want you to give our last panel your full attention. And our first presenter is Leora Eisenberg, who is a current PhD student in history at Harvard University, where she studies processes of Russification and Sovietization in Soviet Central Asia. She graduated from Princeton University summa cum laude in 2020, where she studies Slavic languages and literature. Leora is a recipient of many scholarships, including critical language scholarship for Persian language study in Tajikistan, Labus Prize, Stryker International Fellowship, and others. When not reading or doing research, Leora enjoys learning foreign languages, and her latest one is Uyghur. So Leora, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm setting my own timer, so I hope you guys will keep me to it. Thank you very much for having me today. I have to say that I'm a little nervous since I'm the only graduate student on this panel, so I hope that you'll forgive any foibles that I may make. Today, I'm going to be talking about the language that we use to talk about language. It's a kind of пережиток of my time studying Slavic studies. I'm going to be talking about the language, the tropes that I hope to demonstrate to you come from the Soviet era, the tropes that the Russian media uses to discuss Kazakhstan's alphabet shift. But before we do that, I think it's important to discuss the history of alphabet shifts in Kazakhstan more generally, right? The two that I'm going to focus on, since they're really the Soviet ones, are 3 and 4. In the 19th century, the Kazakhs adopt the Arabic alphabet, the Chagatai alphabet, as many Turkic peoples do at the time, at step 1. In the early 20th century, Batursinov reforms the Arabic alphabet, that's step 2. It's taught in schools until 1930. And then in the 1930s, Kazakhstan, as pretty much every other Muslim region in the Soviet Union, adopts NTA, the New Turkic alphabet, which is really a Latin alphabet. It's kept for 10 years until 1940, when the Soviet government mandates that these very same Muslim peoples that had recently just adopted Latin switch to Cyrillic, which is kept up until the present day, as you can see if you walk around the city. But if you walk around the city just a little bit more, you'll see, I saw a sign when we were driving here, Khana was written in Latin, right? So you can see that this shift to Latin is ongoing, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the reasoning, the Soviet government's reasoning behind these shifts, which will really lay the foundation for understanding the tropes that we see in the media. So the switch to the 1930s, this was step 3, every reason for it can really be subsumed under the idea of bringing Kazakhs and other Muslim peoples out of backwardness, отсталость, into culture, культура, and I'm using that in the Soviet sense of the term, and we'll get to that in a minute. There are a number of reasons for backwardness here. Arabic was considered to have contributed to illiteracy, and that's a major part of the Soviet legacy, as we know. It's associated with Islam in the Soviet mind, which is in turn associated with the oppression of women and so on and so forth. And Arabic was also considered to be markedly not international, which was a value at the time. 10 years later, right, the Soviet government makes all these Muslim people switch to Cyrillic because a kind of understanding is that, okay, we've brought them out of отсталость, out of backwardness and into culture. Now we're shifting the alphabet to reflect a new political reality, which was, I note here, the facilitation, it was meant to facilitate the learning of Russian and assimilation into a Russian-dominated, or if we don't want to think of it that way, then certainly Russophonic culture. I'm not going to talk about the Kazakh government's reasoning for shifting out from this to Latin, but if you look through Nazarbayev's and Tokayev's speeches, they talk about international, they use the same language that the Soviet government certainly did. So let's talk about the Russian media's response to this most recent shift out of Cyrillic and into Latin that is ongoing. And it really uses, as I note at the bottom of the slide, these Soviet tropes that we've just kind of been exposed to of unity, which includes but is not limited to the idea of ethnic internationalism, literacy, and culture. This isn't without precedent, this use of Soviet tropes in the Russian media's coverage of alphabet shifts. And we see it in Tatarstan in 2000, which, as you probably know, unsuccessfully tried to switch to Latin. This is a headline from Известия. Язычники, языковая реформа, задуманная властями Казани, может поссорить русских и татар. If you notice, I highlighted the first word, язычники, which is in itself a play on words, right? Язычник means language person, and it also can be translated as heathen or barbarian, suggesting that those who are interested in alphabet shifts and in questions of changing language, or from Cyrillic to Latin, are reversing the culture that they were brought into via the Cyrillic alphabet, and instead being brought to the backwardness of old, right? This isn't without precedent. But why does Russia really care? Why do we care? Why does Russia care? Why does the Russian media care about alphabet shifts? It's removed, right? But the Cyrillic alphabet is symbolic. Alphabets are symbolic, as you see in the Mark Seba quote at the bottom. Scripts have symbolic power, which transcends language itself. They're symbols, right? And the Cyrillic alphabet, in our particular case, is a symbol of the past, of Soviet dominance over culture, language, and literacy, all of which, as I hope to demonstrate, are really intertwined. And the reality is that nearly all post-Soviet states understand this, which is why in 1991, nearly immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many post-Soviet states switched to Latin very quickly. Namely, Azerbaijan was right on the money. Uzbekistan, Moldova, Turkmenistan, they were all very, very, very quick shifts. But this most common trope that we see in the literature covering nearly all of these, the Russian media's coverage of all of these countries' language shifts, and especially here with Kazakhstan, and we saw in Tatarstan, is this idea of a rupture with the Soviet past, which I've already begun to talk about. And these are the three most common sub-tropes: a loss of culture, kultura, I mean that really in the Soviet sense of the term, a return to backwardness, right, which allegedly these peoples were brought out of via literacy done in Cyrillic, a drop in literacy, which is a reversal of the literacy achieved via Soviet alphabets and Soviet programs, namely in and by Cyrillic, and three is interethnic and generational divides, which is a reversal of the internationalism and the unity achieved via the Russian language and Cyrillic alphabet. So let's talk about subtrope one, okay? It's loss of culture. I'm really using culture here in the Soviet use of kultura. I cannot stress that enough. And as you can see in the Svetlana Boymko, which I'm not going to read on the slide, literature played an enormous role in the creation of kulturный человек, of kultura, which in turn brought people to kulturность. I'm assuming we all know these terms. Kulturность, which is the the possession of certain manners, mores, politesse, and so on and so forth. Consumption of literature was part of kultura, and in turn, consuming literature made you a kulturный человек, someone who was polite, behaved well, so on and so forth. Kultura then leads us to национальная культура, national culture, which I define the same way that Sidney Kaplan does, which is artistic products that are generated by members of a national group and or that express national identity. Lecharsky defines national culture really, really, really well. Okay, and actually he's talking about national theater here, but he talks about national language, history of the people, rising above narrow national content to be international. Right? So the consumption of национальная культура involves, of course, национальная литература, which in turn makes one культурный, right? Someone who is behaving well, knows one's people's history and one's literature. So Kazakh national culture, национальная культура, especially национальная литература for our purposes, which is of course published in Cyrillic, it reflects Kazakh history and culture, if we're going to use Lunacharsky's definition, is in the Kazakh language, which, as we I'm sure all know, is not always the case, and espouses Soviet ideology. And let's remember, of course, that this национальная культура, национальная литература was codified and canonized by such organs as the Union of Writers, right? The idea of национальная культура, национальная литература was determined in large part by the Soviet state, which of course was also the one to implement Cyrillicization in the first place. So here's a great example of an article that uses such tropes. It's from 2017, and I actually think it's a very important article. I'm only going to do one quote from each article for the purposes of time, but this is a quote from the article. Заводы СССР в Казахстане был создан очень солидный пласт литературы. We see this all the time. So the солидный пласт литературы is essentially the creation of национальная культура in the Soviet sense. Она была переведена и опубликована на кириллице. Все это будет потеряно особенно для последующих поколений, who in effect lose access to their national culture, национальная культура, through being unable to read it since it's not going to be republished in Latin, right? That's one strike against Latin. We see another, can you move it? Thank you. You can see how negative this article is going to be just by the headline alone, right? This is the lenta.ru. Oh, the clicker stopped working. Thank you. And you can see here again this idea that the implementation of Latin will detract from национальная культура and культура more generally. На самом деле мотивом министра Магомедова выступать за казахизацию школ, which includes in itself teaching more Kazakh and moving everyone to the Latin alphabet for Kazakh, достаточно ясны, имеют мало общего заботы о национальном языке и культуре, which is to say that the implementation of Latin in effect will detract from национальная культура and affect the культурность of the young generation in Kazakhstan. Subtrope 2, heavily related, of course. Literacy is a primary component of, I should have written cultura and not culture, of cultura. And a big part of the Soviet claim to success in Kazakhstan and much of the Muslim regions of the Soviet Union is its liquidation of illiteracy, right? Ликвидация безграмотности. As Lunacharsky, whom we just saw, said, the illiterate person not only stood outside of politics, but stood outside of culture. Such blossoming of culture takes place under Cyrillic, in large part because of the publication of books that this newly literate people could now read, right? So we see, again, let's go back to my favorite article. Вся национальная литература и учебники написаны на кириллице. Сейчас это все придется пересдавать. Неизбежно молодежь, которая и так мало читает, будет хуже знать казахскую литературу. Because you see that he's kind of the author of the article, Yuda Bogdanov, is kind of repeating this trope of standing outside of culture because they won't have the opportunity to read books. They won't have the opportunity to even consume their национальная культура and thus become illiterate in their own culture. This is another great one. You can see in the headline alone, из латиницы начался отток детей из казахских школ, right? They are literally becoming illiterate in Kazakh because of the change in alphabets. I'm not going to go over this whole thing because it's really quite long and it's not all that interesting, but it's a Facebook post from someone named Dastan Yildizev, who is a philologist and linguist, who essentially says at the bottom that наши лингвисты не создали оригинальную письменность, blah, 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 it's all bad, it's all bad. Надо ли говорить, что эта латиница вызовет отток школьников в русские школы? Уже вызвала, будет препятствовать изучению развитию языка, right? So this change in the alphabets is not only leading people to study a superior language with a superior alphabet that is now going to be the bearer of culture and literacy, but it's going to affect the development of the Kazakh language itself. I mean, I'm not saying I believe this. This is what's being said here. And then subtrope 3, I have 3.5 minutes, we're doing well, is interethnic and intergenerational divides that will be created via the alphabet shift. Russian was viewed as the second mother tongue, the common language of all Soviet citizens, and the language of interethnic communication, which is still used today, depending on the time period. So this great stress on how Russian brings people together. And you can see in the Shirmuhamedov quote at the bottom, how learning Russian was even viewed as helping your own nationality and helping the development of your own language. We can talk about that some other time. But if the Russian language binds people together, it was even called Ruskaya Graphicheskaya Baza in much of the literature. So does its alphabet. So the Cyrillic language in effect becomes the common alphabet of all Soviet people. Here's a great example. It's another Izvestia article. You can see Izvestia stands pretty quickly, but in it, it talks about Zhanar and Oleg. I'm not going to show you the quote. It'll take way too long, but it talks about how Zhanar and Oleg are both fine, really learning the new alphabet. Zhanar is Kazakh speaking. She's probably ethnically Kazakh. It doesn't say that explicitly. She's from Shymkent, but she talks about how her grandparents are learning the new alphabet as a new language. They can't, and she says that they struggle going to the bank. They can't use documents, all of that, and how she kind of suggests that they will be outside of culture and they'll be separate from her and her younger peers because they won't know the new alphabet, right? That's more of an intergenerational divide than an interethnic one, and I realized that. And the second example is Oleg, Russian speaking, probably ethnically Russian, though it doesn't say that, from Pavlodar, and he says that he has no problem learning it, right? No intergenerational, no interethnic divide there, but his grandparents and his parents are going to struggle because they see the adoption of, I should have said Latin, not Cyrillic. They see that the adoption of Cyrillic, they interpret the adoption of Cyrillic to be a rejection of their, he didn't say there, but of open bracket there, close bracket, Russian culture, русская культура. So here we really see that their interethnic divide in the second example. Here's another one, right? This is an RT, барьер между поколениями. You can see it already in the headline, right? And here it says, this is a great quote, I think, опыт других государств показал, что переучиться на новую транскрипцию не могут не только глубокие старики, но даже люди от 40 до 50 лет, right? В результате накопленный ими багаж знаний останется при них, вне зависимости от их идейной направленности, which is a very similar idea, as you see in the second paragraph, to the disappearance of national culture. Right? Речь идет также об отказе от советского прошлого. She's pretty much acknowledging that she's acknowledging my theory that these quotes are about a rupture with the Soviet past. Не секрет, что весь основной массив литературы, we saw this before, солидный пласт литературы всех центральноазиатских республик связан с кириллическим периодом. I love how she's periodizing this as Cyrillic, but we see here that we're losing, the intergenerational divide is also kind of the same idea as a loss of national culture. Right, so I'm 34 seconds doing really, really well. So as we get to my conclusion. So if you take away one thing from this presentation, this is what I want you to take away. When we talk about tropes in literature about the Russian media's coverage of the Kazakhstani language shift, it's really all subsumed under this idea of a rupture with the Soviet past, which is this rupture in three major ways: a loss of culture, a loss of literacy, and a loss of unity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Leora, thank you very much. I really loved how you accentuated your Russian quotes while reading at great speed. It's cool. We had this чтение с выражением, like на скорость. You would have been like the champion of all the Olympiads. It's just really impressed. Now we are moving to our own Schenk, who is an associate professor of political science at Nazarbayev University. With teaching and research expertise in the politics of immigration and national identity in Eurasia, her latest book, published with the University of Toronto Press, is called Why Control Immigration? Strategic Uses of Migration Management in Russia. Kares, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alima. So my paper today really wrestles with the question of whether official data can be both hegemonic and symbolic at the same time in a way that allows for multiple meanings to coexist. And then in my example, I'm using Russian migration data, specifically labor migration from Central Asia to Russia. So this seemingly kind of counterintuitive question is driven by this observation in Russia that the state puts a really clear priority on quantitative data in the migration sphere. They love to count migrants, but it's also widely accepted that there's a lot of inaccuracies in this data, and that these inaccuracies are not necessarily addressed by the state methodologies. So the paper really probes the kind of potential uses of these data gaps and seeks an explanation that doesn't really rely necessarily on a state function or state dysfunction, meaning like bad governance or something like this, but maybe looks kind of beneath state capacity and how migration data can act as a sort of symbol of state capacity. Another way of stating this is how true does data need to be in order to be actually meaningful on a number of different registers? So there's a critical literature on data that looks at the uses of state data that demonstrates once state data actually is produced, it becomes a reality that the state acts on. It uses data, its own official data, to evaluate its own effectiveness, to build future policies, and to message the public in legitimacy appeals. And also it uses, the state itself is kind of a primary audience for its own data. There's also a literature about how data, especially census data, racializes. And I think that's an important component for kind of tying this paper into the themes of the conference. And so in this sense, I'm using the term hegemonic to denote something systemic. And I would actually use it synonymously, which might be a bit unorthodox or heretical for some, synonymously with something like empire or colonial, because like in a sort of metaphorical sense, in the sense that in this contemporary period, these are the systems that are already in place that really ossify social relations in a way that prevents minorities, in this case migrants, from being treated as anything other than the other. But I focus specifically on data hegemony in this paper, or data systems and how data systems come to be. Many of these critical data studies are Foucauldian in an orientation, both in terms of biopolitics, in terms of governmentality, and in their sort of genealogical critique of power structures. And the general thrust of this quantification of persons literature, which spans kind of sociology and anthropology, is that data becomes quite hegemonic. And this is really not surprising from a biopolitical perspective, because most of the applications of biopolitics in the current period really see the state as often even illegitimately encroaching on the individual lives of citizens. So my paper first explores kind of theoretically how data can be used to make truth claims, or then how data can be used to construct something symbolic. And then I turn to an empirical exploration of how data is constructed, suggesting ways that data can be projected in a way that can be used in multiple symbolic ways. So let me see where I am on my slides. Oh, I'm not there yet. So for Foucault, the biopolitical turn towards managing populations in a strategic and administrative way began in the 18th century as a sort of modernization, as modernization and liberalism converged. And he is, of course, speaking in the Western European context, but Russian intellectuals in the imperial period were also caught up in these debates over positivism, rationalism, statistical thinking that emerged from European thinkers around the same time. And this led to developments such as the establishment of statistical corps in the Zemstva in the mid-19th century, which very interestingly used probabilistic sampling strategies to gather official data at the local level, and this becomes very important. The Soviet period saw a sort of further rationalization of data collection, but there was a really important shift from probabilistic methodologies to those based on complete enumeration, which is what we see in censuses, or what we see in the ways that we often see administrative data. And also, certainly in the Soviet period, a sort of evolution towards the realization of political goals over imperial realities. So both of these historical tendencies are really important for understanding how we use data today in the Russian context. So the biopolitical orientation of data production, I think, is crucial to recognize. I mean, it's crucial because it's really quantifying bodies, right? It's turning bodies into data points, and this is kind of the biopolitical basis. But at the same time, going back to this sort of trajectory of, well, part of it is about making bodies kind of maximally market ready, right? And in this sense, a biopolitical approach really recognizes the market value of migrants in the labor market, at the same time that it renders them an object of political power. So migrants are really central to the economy, and they should be also seen as something that is vital for a state, and the state needs to foster this sense of value. But when you have a group like migrants, migrant workers that are not always welcomed by host societies, the state can find itself in a situation where they can't really ascribe value outright in a direct sort of way. And so in this situation, migrant data can be produced in a sort of selective way, as I'll show in a few minutes, that allows migrants to remain in the system, but be marketed to the public in a way that can be more kind of palatable. So in this sense, the migrant labor itself is a sort of productive output of governmentality, but the data is also a sort of governmentality output. And so that becomes important as well. So let me just talk through a little bit about kind of the knowledge claims and then the symbolic claims of data, and then get to the empirical example. So biopolitically derived data is used by the state to make truth claims. And in this way, the migration statistics create a sort of truth discourse, or a picture of what the government projects to be true. And these two concepts of veridiction and parrhesia are important in the writing of Foucault to kind of unpack that, though I don't think I'll belabor that very much. But basically, the idea of veridiction is just this sort of place in which something is projected to be true and it actually achieves the level of truth. So this is kind of the truth value. And Parisia is this idea of a modality of telling the truth, or the way that the truth comes to be. And in this sense, the fact that migration data is largely publicly available, though selective, is it encounters this sort of modality of telling the truth. But I don't want to belabor that because those points are a little bit abstract. I'd rather kind of move on to the symbolic aspect, or how this data becomes more symbolic. And so here I'm kind of taking an exercise from semiotics, where the thing that we're looking at, that we're trying to represent, is this sort of object over here, which is immigration control. And then we can represent this in various sorts of ways, by words or other types of more or less sort of symbolic representations. So let's say here that the thing that we're trying to represent over here is immigration control. And that immigration control is represented or signified by data in some way that evokes then an image of immigration control in people's minds. As an object, or that thing that we're trying to evoke, immigration control is the effort of states to limit, direct the flow of citizens into their territory, to manage those people once they've arrived. And it involves material realities, such as physical boundaries, barriers, documents that are signed, that are stamped, interactions between state agents and migrants. And these are realities that are represented by migration data and other types of symbolic renderings. The migration data that's produced by state agents and projected for public consumption and for state consumption as well is meant to be a literal representation of migration control. So we could say that it's sort of iconic over here, because it's meant to be literal. And this is because migration data in Russia is premised on this idea of complete enumeration, mentality, and methodology, which uses as its main output administrative data that's collected by the border police or migration services. And this means that it's supposed to represent, one number in the migration data is supposed to represent one migrant doing something, whether it's getting a document or crossing a border or what have you. Nevertheless, the data that's produced by state agents is in fact an abstraction of these material realities and the interpersonal interactions of immigration control. So these numerical indicators of immigration control actually become quite symbolic when they're kind of separated from the actions that happen on the ground. And then they become further symbolic when the meanings generated by the immigration data comes to denote something that is actually more than what is reflected in the numbers. And then this is where I come to my empirical example, because sometimes the immigration data as a whole is used to represent how well the state is controlling immigration, even though that it assumes to control populations of immigration that are actually not represented in the data. So my empirical example looks specifically at the place of Kyrgyz labor migrants in the data, or as you'll notice here, not in the data, from 2014 on. So these data come from Rosstat, which is the government statistical agency, and also from the migration services, which are a part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And in some ways, the data picture for labor migrants is highly detailed in Russia, and yet it's quite disjointed because the data don't always agree across publications or agency, but there are a lot of data points. I'm just looking at one data point, and that is the document that's issued to migrants called a patient. And so patients, they started to be issued in 2010, so before this data is represented on the screen. And they made a really quite demonstrable change in from 2014 to 2015. So we see that the number of patients that were issued it drops dramatically from 2014 to 2015. And there's a couple of reasons for this. And then I'll also talk about why the Kyrgyz migrants dropped out of the data. So there were three interlocking developments from around 2014. One is a policy change that fundamentally altered how patents would be issued. So prior to 2014, we have migrants from CIS countries, so primarily Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, but also all of the other CIS countries, using patents and work permits to get permission to work in Russia. So there were two different mechanisms. One was the patent. Patent was supposed to be used only for household workers or something like this, but they actually were used informally for lots of different migrants. Because they were comparatively easy to get. Starting in 2015, it became much more highly bureaucratized and therefore much more difficult for migrants to get a patent. Also, 2014, 2015, we see an effect on the numbers that comes from the ruble crisis, sanctions related to Crimean annexation. And we also see in 2015, Kyrgyz entry into the Eurasian Economic Union. And so kind of the bigger picture of this that I could maybe explain a little bit in more detail if this doesn't make sense in the Q&A. But in Russia, as in many migrant receiving countries, there's just always a lot of public and rhetorical pressure to reduce migration. And so in 2015, when we have the Kyrgyz labor migrants moving into the Eurasian Economic Union and therefore having free access to the labor market, no need for permits, this could potentially have caused a backlash. And so what we see, I think, is a sort of strategic decision to simply just not publish the number of Kyrgyz labor migrants in any sort of demonstrable way after 2015. So you literally cannot find statistics on Kyrgyz labor migrants because they don't use this sort of patent mechanism. They use a different mechanism that is just not systematically collected or issued in any sort of documents, definitely not aggregated at the national level. And this sort of selective absence of data is, I think, quite strategic on the part of the government and allows some sort of, it allows this sort of numbers of total labor migrants to stand in for something that it doesn't actually represent, right? If there are Kyrgyz labor migrants working in the Russian Federation, then it actually allows them to be not represented here, even though you have these numbers of immigration control overall. So I will suggest that that's symbolic. I would like to unpack it more, but I'm at the end of my time, so I'm sorry.
Thank you, Ares. And our next paper is co-authored between Alexei Trochev, Gavin Slade, both at Nazarbayev University, and Leora Piacentini from the University of Strathclyde. And we have two presenters. So Alexei Trochev is Alexei Trochev is an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Political Science at Nazarbayev University, and Gavin Slade is an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, and they are together collaborating as a political scientist and a sociologist under the project, which is funded by ESRC, in the Gulag's shadow, producing, consuming, and perceiving prisons in the former Soviet Union. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to talk. Alexei has been very kind enough to give me the floor because he's tired out after moderating that last session. We have been collaborating on this project for the last 3.5 years, which is called In the Gulag Shadow. So usually I've actually presented this research before, but usually I've presented to criminologists, and I have to try to convince criminologists that Eurasia, Kazakhstan, Russia are interesting cases for them to actually be bothered with, to actually study themselves. Obviously, for this presentation, I have to convince you that criminology and criminological questions are of interest for the themes for this conference. So I'm already thinking about ways that this research ties with the themes in the conference. And one, it seems to me, is the sort of Gulag legacy here in Kazakhstan particularly, and the way that that actually plays out. I think it plays out in quite surprising ways, not how you might expect it to play out. And I'll sort of try to pick up those themes as I go through. Okay, so the big research question, what I'll try to answer for you in the next 50 minutes is the question of why has Kazakhstan's prison rate been declining for the past 20 years? Basically, I'll put that as a puzzle. Theoretically, criminological theory doesn't really give us an answer to that question. It's not entirely clear. If you just look at Western theories of decarceration and incarceration penal change, it's not really clear why. So to actually try to answer the question, I sort of flip the question a little bit and put the question in terms of who reduced Kazakhstan's prison rate. So that is about the actors trying to bring agency in. So what we end up looking at is the prison service. So we actually find the prison service is quite a big decarcerating actor, an actor that actually was advocating for and pushing for penal reduction, penal downsizing. Now, again, that is counterintuitive and not what you'd expect. So we try to explain why that is, and again, I'll try to get to that. So this is Kazakhstan's prison rate. This is the number of prisoners incarcerated per 100,000 of the population. What you can see in the lines that are sort of blurred out, that's all of the former Soviet countries. And we've got Kazakhstan sort of just highlighted here. Now you can see there's a general trend right across the former Soviet Union that all these former Soviet countries are decarcerating. Roughly from the year 2000, you can sort of see a steady decline. But Kazakhstan actually is a leader in this. It's been decarcerating quicker and more steeply than virtually any other country in the region. I just draw your attention quickly to put a pin in it for later, but 1985 to 1990, you also see decarceration occurring during this whole period of perestroika, glasnost, and so on. Then you see an uptick in the 1990s and then this decline in the 2000s. So this data is collected around the world every year by a university in the United Kingdom, and they have they call it the World Prison Brief, and they position countries in a sort of league table according to how many prisoners they have per 100,000 population. And this turns out to be quite important as well for the explanation of what happened in Kazakhstan. Okay, so that's the trend. Could you change the slide, please? Sorry, it doesn't seem to work. Okay, so, and just very quickly, we can see Kazakhstan here. This is the percentage change in the prison rate 2000-2020. What we can see is Kazakhstan here is a leader at 64%. Ukraine's higher, but Ukraine is something of an outlier given the circumstances, the conflict and war since 2014. What I'd also put a pin in is if you look here, you can see Russia is also decarcerating quicker than the average for the region. You can also see Uzbekistan is too. So there seems to be something of a relationship between authoritarianism and decarceration, which again seems rather counterintuitive. We would assume that authoritarian leaders, as they backslide on democracy, tend to incarcerate more people. So what's going on? Okay, this is a very strange hobby of mine, which is to visit these places where they've closed penal colonies on the weekends. So this is Gorny. This is in northern Kazakhstan Oblast, Zhaman-Sopka. This is Karajal in Karagandinsk Oblast. This is Kushmarun, Kostanayske. Kushmarun was the biggest penal colony in Kazakhstan in the dying days of the Soviet Union. So these places are all just stood there now as sort of testaments to the decarceration process in Kazakhstan. So if we try to explain this process, right, if we try to get to the point of explanation, why would this be occurring? Well, if you look at the Western literature, the theories of why countries incarcerate more or less people, fewer people, you see different types of explanations. One type of theory here is simply about a culture of punishment, about the effective elements here. So how much punishment do you want to see in your society, right? So you can do a survey, you find out if people really want more punishment, they want to see more people in prison. And what we see is these types of theories that suggest that where you have punitiveness, that is people wanting more and more, prison for people, this has an impact on policymakers. Policymakers integrate that into their policy decisions, and you see upticks in incarceration. So you see this very clearly in the United States, in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom. So criminologists in the West tend to be quite obsessed with penal upsizing. That is when prison rates go up. We don't really have much of a theory about when prison rates go down. Another aspect of this culture of punishment idea would be the historical legacy. So again, with Kazakhstan, you would expect when the Soviet Union collapses, Kazakhstan has a huge penal infrastructure, right? It has lots and lots of places for lots and lots of prisoners. And it's been working with this Soviet culture of punishment for the last 70 years. Again, this would be a risk factor. You would expect prison rates to go up because you have the capacity and the culture to put people in prison. Public opinion, for what we have in terms of our own data as well, suggests that the Kazakhstani population is actually quite punitive. Kazakhstan is one prison for offenders. So it seems to go against public opinion for what public opinion is worth in Kazakhstan. So the other factors you might see are things like high levels of inequality, where you see marginalized groups of people. The criminal justice system tends to pick those marginalized groups up. So migrants, the poor, minorities, and so on. In Kazakhstan, we've seen this sort of levels of social protection going down, high levels of inequality in society. So again, on a macro level, we would expect prison rates to be going up in Kazakhstan, not down. There's a lack of political pluralism, super presidential system, again, political factor. The literature suggests that you would expect, again, the prison's population to be going up. So again, the puzzle is there, right? I'm still pushing on this puzzle. Why is it going down? So to try to get to the explanation, we've been doing this research, basically, we call it an agonist approach, which is not our word. It's basically to insert agency into the process. So who were the policymakers? Who were the people who argue for this policy, who push for it? This approach basically looks at penal policy as a field of contestation, right? So with any policy field, you see different actors who have different interests in particular types of policy outcomes. So we have all sorts of particular stakeholders, right? So politicians, media, victims groups, the broader public, prisoners' rights groups, human rights activists, prison officers, and the private sector. Now, prison services in the literature, if you look in the West, in places like America, you see prison services generally want more prisons, right? Prison officers, they form trade unions, and they want to see their industry expand, basically. So we expect them to be pushing for actual penal upsizing. Now, in Kazakhstan, that didn't happen, and that's also one of these puzzles we think is very interesting. So we've done a number of interviews, elite level interviews in Kazakhstan and in Russia, but I'm just focusing on Kazakhstan today. And we did a survey of public opinion as well in Kazakhstan and Russia. So the downsizing agents in Kazakhstan, the people that come out very clearly in the interviews, people in the presidential administration, so this is coming top down from the presidential administration, prosecutor's office, the prison service, and then international human rights bodies like Penal Reform International, the Soros Foundation, Council of Europe, and so on. So obviously the curious thing here is the prison service. We're particularly interested in that question. Why the prison service? So I'll talk a little bit for about 2 or 3 minutes about the prison service particularly. And here again, you'll see the sort of perverse incentives that are produced, I think, by certain legacies that come from the Soviet period. That's where the legacy argument can still be brought in, I think. Okay, so in terms of norms and thinking about how normatively people in the prison service were thinking about punishment by the 1990s and the early 2000s, when you start to see this decrease in the prison population occurring, what we tried to do is look at the longue durée. So we're doing these interviews and asking about how this idea of humanization, as they call it, humanizatsiya, emerges into the discourse. And we see that that goes back into the Soviet period, actually. It goes back into the 1980s. So this isn't some new idea that just comes in the 1990s when Kazakhstan democratizes and becomes independent. This is something that has a longer history. So we see that there is this sort of socialization of these prison service chiefs in the 1990s into thinking about humanization, even before that in the 1980s. So we see actually, for example, the Yaroslavl experiment, they actually introduced that was rolled out as well in Kazakhstan, in Soviet Kazakhstan, in Pavlodar. These were about creating smaller prisons and these smaller otriady, smaller brigades for people to work within, for the prisoners to work within. The whole idea was to try to reduce the number of people in prisons, even back then. We also see foreign influence here, so people from the prison service going abroad, going to Sweden, going to Poland. Poland comes across as being a very, very important case in terms of dissemination of knowledge about reforms. Now, of course, that's because in Poland you had the elite that came into power in Poland in the 1990s had been political prisoners. So they were very interested in penal reform straight away in the 1990s. And that knowledge diffusion came through Poland into Kazakhstan. But Russia is also a very important actor here, which is also quite counterintuitive. But Russia also played a big role in disseminating certain types of ideas, thank you, in terms of humanization. So that's particularly concerning moving the prison service from the Ministry of Interior, the MVD, to the Ministry of Justice, which it did for a while, and then they moved it back, so it's under the Ministry of Interior now. So in terms of norms, we have this. In terms of incentives and opportunities, well, in the 1990s, there's an economic crisis, there's a medical crisis going on in prisons, so the prison service don't have a big incentive to keep lots of prisoners in their prisons because prison officers don't want to get ill, they don't want to catch tuberculosis, and also they don't have enough money to really keep people in prison and look after them. So we have this element too. There's a couple of other elements that I would like to really focus on in the time I've got left. One is performativity, which is coming back to this idea of how you collect data. It's actually quite similar to what Gavin was talking about. Quantification, what does it signify, the number of prisoners you have in your prisons? The structure of the prison service and the issue of its militarization. So it's still militarized and it's still under the Ministry of Interior, and that creates its own perverse incentives, as we'll see, which again could be seen as a legacy argument. Okay, so firstly, performativity. The prison rate, just the number of prisoners per 100,000 of the population. Forget about the quality of the prisons, forget about how the prisoners are treated, just what's the number? That seems to be a particularly important thing. What does that signal about what's happening in Kazakhstan? So it's just used as a signal to try to show that we're humanizing somehow the society. So we have this quote from one of the former prison service chiefs, that a low prison rate will show the security of society and the investment attractiveness of the state. So it's actually about, you know, if you invest in Kazakhstan, don't worry, there won't be any big prison scandals because we don't have that many prisoners anyway. If we look at, for example, this quote, we see this former deputy chief of the prison service talking about that in the 90s, they were very aware of where Kazakhstan was positioned in this league table. It was third in the world, right? It was America's #1, Russia #2, and then Kazakhstan. And that looked bad. There was an international image problem there. So performativity is really important. Now, one element here would, why would we not see what we see in America, which is when the Americans tried to reduce prison populations, the prison officers' unions, they kicked back against it and tried to resist that. We don't see that here. Why not? Well, one reason is because the prison service staff are still under the Ministry of Interior. Prisons are not necessarily their thing, right? They're just guard stuff. They can guard something else. If they don't guard a prison, they'll guard a warehouse for you. They'll guard, you know, a building for you. So they can just be rotated within the Ministry of Interior. Their jobs are not dependent specifically on the existence of prisons, right? So they can move around within the Ministry of Interior. So, well, okay, we're not resisting because we actually don't like guarding prisons. Prisons are pretty dirty places. We're happy to go and guard something else for you if you'd like. So you don't see this necessarily this sort of resistance within the prison service because they have other jobs that they can be going to. And their professional culture is not a prison service culture. They don't have trade unions. They're not allowed to form trade unions. They're not allowed to join prison political parties either. 2 minutes. So we can see there's no real incentive structure there to resist this downsizing. So perversely, this ends up leading to decarceration without any resistance from the prison population. So we can see this prison officer attitudes. You can see this is a survey from 2009 of Pavlodar prison officers. We can see they're very, very punitive, basically. They want really harsh conditions. They want really harsh punishment for prisoners. But if you just look at this number here, this is about the number of prisoners that should it be further reduced? You can see that that's a relatively sort of ambivalent answer. Yeah, well, maybe, maybe not. But these questions about should the prison regime actually be harsh, everybody's saying yes, yes, they should. So prison officers are very, very punitive, but they don't really care how many prisoners there are in the prison. They just want the prisons to be awful places that are really bad for them. Okay, so this is finally then the conclusion. So yeah, and skip again, go to that. I'm sorry for these pictures as well. So actually, in the Western criminological literature, we don't really have a very good theory for explaining why authoritarian regimes are downsizing in the former Soviet Union. The Western literature just simply doesn't have a theory to explain it. So this is one of our goals, is to try to think of that theory ourselves. So what would be happening? So a few things that we think are theoretically relevant and be happy to test them empirically in different cases. Downsizing can be used as a signal of the rule of law. So this is advertising the World Prison Brief, advertising that figure to try to show, look how humane we are, look how great we are, look, we have rule of law, we're reducing the number of prisoners. It also is useful for an authoritarian leader if they can reduce the number of prisoners while maintaining conditions, bad conditions. That means to say basically they don't actually have to ask their prison service to change the way they do things, right? They're not actually changing the way that they're policing and actually guarding the prisons. So that's less likely to produce any resistance. So basically that's like, we'll allow you this type of discretion in return for your loyalty to us, right, as a security service. Also, downsizing only applies to common crimes, right? So it's not about, political crimes. So if we look at Kazakhstan, for example, if you look at the number of people incarcerated under the articles for extremism and terrorism, you see a massive increase. So we see this. So if you break down that prison population, we see that certain types of prisoners are actually increasing. And also downsizing presumably saves some sort of money, right? So there's an economic incentive. So we think when these types of conditions hold, you would expect there's an elective affinity for this type of policy to emerge, right? It's not inevitable, but it's more likely. The probability increases. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin and Alexei. И сегодня наш последний спикер Игорь Крупко. Правильно? Крупко. Игорь Крупко в 2022 году завершил обучение в докторантуре Института истории и права КЗНПУ имени Абая. Тема его диссертации – семиозис нарративов исторической памяти казахстанского общества с 1991 до 2021 годов. Игорь Крупко – лауреат республиканского конкурса научных работ по истории Казахстана. В 2018 году он занял первое место и победитель международного конкурса научно-методических разработок молодых преподавателей СНГ «Учимся учить» в 2019 году.
Хорошо, спасибо. Я хотел заранее предупредить и извиниться, если я немного выйду за регламент, за пределы регламента, и прошу мне это разрешить, потому что, как говорил Сахаров Михаилу Горбачеву на съезде народных депутатов СССР, моя тема имеет принципиальное значение. Значит, это один из действительно важнейших сюжетов исторической памяти, и я постараюсь уложиться. Ключевой для обретения казахами исторической субъектности в 20 веке сюжет – это утрата кочевого образа жизни, модифицированная игра символов кочевой экзистенции из точки ее невозврата, городского хронотопа седентаризованной кочевой культуры, рецепция исторической памятью постномадов, наследие средневековой городской культуры Центральной Азии, диалог новой исторической субъектности с мировой культурой, вписывание национального в планетарное и переизобретение ее образов, увиденных казахской интеллигенцией в отражениях древней истории. Исследованный материал позволяет осмыслить проблему соотношения кочевого и оседлого в исторической памяти казахстанского общества и наличие здесь культурной травмы внеисторичности, преодолеваемой национальной интеллигенцией со второй половины XX века. К факторам, сформировавшим эту культурную травму, можно отнести: первое – прерывание кочевой культуры в результате насильственной коллективизации и седентаризации. И второе – историографическую традицию описания кочевой культуры как регрессивной и ее восприятие казахской интеллигенцией 60-х, 70-х годов через доминировавший исторический нарратив. Способом преодоления этой травмы стала рецепция культурного наследия средневековой городской культуры Центральной Азии, активное археологическое исследование, которое начинается в эти годы в КЗССР, и вписывание переизобретаемой исторической субъектности во всемирную историю цивилизации. Выстроенная советская иерархия исторических субъектностей задавала условия, приведшие к ее краху в 1991 году. Иерархия младших и старших братьев, республик, народов изначально создавала возможность для удревнения и реконтекстуализации ущемленной такой иерархии исторической субъектности. Форма и новая хронология советской истории, декларировавшей подлинное начало и бытие новообразованных наций с проекта эмансипации из тюрьмы народов, гнета баев-феодалов, патриархальной отсталости, порождала естественную неудовлетворенность национальной интеллигенции и стремление отыскать более древние корни, зачастую идеализируя, если не полузапретные, то, по крайней мере, полузабытые истоки национальной культуры, вписываемой в мировую древность, что явилось стартом процессов уже позднее мифологизации, глорификации и виктимизации исторической памяти казахстанского общества уже в эпоху после 1991 года. Для большинства культур, прошедших сначала колониальный опыт, а затем опыт модернизации в статусе субалтерна, статусом культурного наследия наделяется древнее и средневековое прошлое, являющееся хронотопом Золотого века. Я опускаю обширную историографию, иллюстрирующую то, о чем я говорю. От имперских ориенталистских нарративов XIX века, удивительным образом иллюстрирующих не только доминирование, но и историческую мобильность, термин, который я ввожу, свойственную образом кочевой культуры в исторической памяти. Значит, через советский язык описания кочевников до проблематизации соотношения кочевого и оседлого в исторической памяти казахстанского общества после 1991 года. Это отдельная тема, которую я могу развить во время ответов на вопросы. А теперь я перехожу к конкретному примеру, в котором сошлись все эти сюжеты. Одному из главных мест памяти казахстанского общества – от Рарской библиотеки. Вкратце сюжет такой. Хотя, я думаю, все знают этот сюжет. Вот. В средневековом городе Отрар существовала вторая в мире по значимости библиотека, уничтоженная во время монгольского завоевания. В этой библиотеке, согласно одним версиям, учился и вырос Аль-Фараби, а согласно другим основал ее. Ну и так далее. Вот это основной сюжет. Главные вопросы этой темы звучат так. Первое. Какова генеалогия образа Отрарской библиотеки? Как происходило ее превращение в место исторической памяти и каковы причины популярности этого образа и нарратива, и как происходило становление местом памяти. Да, спасибо. Значит, у этой истории есть, если говорить конкретно, в статье это все расширено, если сужать все до конкретики, в этой истории есть два отца-основателя. Это Акжан Машанов и Кемаль Акишев. Они начали практически одновременно, но обо всем по порядку. Важной причиной, во многом сформировавшей нарратив о средневековых памятниках как объектах культурного наследия и оказавшей значительное влияние на исторические нарративы, стала хрущевская антирелигиозная кампания. Период обострения борьбы с религией в СССР, пик который пришелся на 58-64 годы, и одновременно некоторых идеологических послаблений, так называемые оттепели, позволивших наполнить некоторые идиократические максимы слегка обновленным содержанием. В рамках этих двух процессов в 1958 году на 13-м съезде в ЛКСМ стартовала вторая волна борьбы за прогрессивные народные традиции, неожиданным образом давшая начало новому витку советского нациостроительства в республиках. Главным идеологическим месседжем стала так называемая борьба за прогрессивные народные традиции, что сформировало последующий исторический нарратив через выведение обрядов, ритуалов, сакральных практик и древних и средневековых археологических памятников из-под определения религиозные и классификации их в качестве народных. Для нашей темы в этом нарративе наиболее яркой работой является книга того же Кемаля Акишева и Агеевой «Древние памятники Казахстана» 1958 года. В ней авторы воспроизводят обозначенный идеологический нарратив следующим образом, как они пишут, цитирую: «Главной задачей брошюры является восстановление исторической правды о роли и значении крупных средневековых мавзолеев», дальше перечисление, которые еще и поныне религиозно настроенной, отсталые частью населения почитаются как святые места, куда они идут на поклонение, совершают обряды. Известно, что строительство их осуществлялось руками народа, под руководством талантливых мастеров-умельцев, выходцев из народа. Поэтому эти памятники считаются не мавзолеями того или иного хана, а национальным памятником, памятником народной архитектуры. Слово «народ» оно наиболее часто в этой книге. Любопытно, и вот, что в этой книге представляется нам первая косвенная попытка упоминания Акишевым образа утраченной библиотеки в разделе, посвященном памятникам Отрарского оазиса, в форме и вот это тоже такая интересная вещь, ссылки на Карла Маркса, писавшего о монгольских завоеваниях Чингисхана, следующее, цитата: «Искусство, богатые библиотеки, превосходное сельское хозяйство, дворцы и мечети – все летит к черту». Черту через «о» написано. Значит, впервые в научном нарративе казахстанской историографии образ этой библиотеки утрарской, уже с таким названием, возникает на страницах Вестника Академии наук КЗССР в мае 1961 года в статье доктора геолого-минералогических наук, член хора Акджана Машанова, получившую известность в 60-70-е годы в качестве писателя, переводчика и популяризатора трудов Аль-Фараби. Впоследствии он взял себе псевдоним Аль-Машани. В самом начале статьи, посвященной Аль-Фараби, Машанов пишет, значит, если перевести на русский: в свое время город Утрар был крупным культурным центром. После знаменитой Александрийской библиотеки, согласно преданиям, самой богатой была Утрарская библиотека. Ссылки на письменные и устные источники этих преданий, конечно, отсутствуют. Возможно, еще одним каузальным аргументом, дополняющим в представлениях Машанова связь между сожженной Александрийской и предполагаемой Утрарской библиотеками, была связь между тем, что Аль-Фараби оказал значительное влияние на мировую философию, во многом благодаря тому, что прокомментировал труды Аристотеля, учителя Александра Македонского. Не вызывает сомнений, что в первую очередь актуализация образа Утрарской библиотеки в 60-е годы в значительной степени связана с рецепцией и освоением культурного наследия Центральной Азии и такой его части, как символические фигуры и культурные герои древности и Средневековья, необходимого для обретения исторической субъектности в условиях советского нациостроительства в республиках. Вот эти труды Машанова, посвященные Аль-Фараби, они оказали большое влияние на историческую память казахской интеллигенции тех лет, и впоследствии, благодаря во многом его деятельности, началась во второй половине 60-х масштабная подготовка 1100-летнего юбилея Аль-Фараби, 1970 год, в рамках которого переводились, создавались его трактаты и так далее. Вот. О возможном первоисточнике информации, подчеркнутой Машановым, мы сообщим далее. Следующий нарратив Public History, обогащенный образом Утрарской библиотеки, ретранслирует его уже через год стихотворением Олжаса Сулейменова, ставшего всесоюзной знаменитостью после поэмы «Земля, поклонись человеку» и оказавшего во многом определяющее влияние на процессы вписывания национальной культуры казахов в мировую историю древности. Вот стихотворение 1962 года «Чем порадовать сердце». В первой половине стихотворения лирический герой на стороне, это вот тоже очень важно, в первой половине он на стороне осажденного города и оплакивает его. Во второй половине, задаваясь вопросом, кем бы я был 10 пыльных столетий назад, осознает, что этнически его предками, скорее всего, являются те, кто был по другую сторону стен сожженного города. И, наконец, в третьей заявляет принципиальную всеотзывчивость, наследуя все истории мира, признавая свое степное происхождение, но утверждая превосходство этического над этническим. Не случайно в стихотворении дважды возникает образ Пушкина, главного символа всемирной отзывчивости в российском литературном контексте. Вот. Ну, я не буду цитировать это стихотворение. В общем, там мелькает образ Утрарской библиотеки. Параллельно с этим в историю включаются археологи. Значит, как там с раскопками было? В 1893 году на вершине сторожевого холма Караул-Тобе, рядом с селом Мамаевка, там был найден клад монет в глиняном кувшине. И это вызвало интерес туркестанского кружка любителей археологии. И, значит, начинается вот эта вот атмосфера легенд, сокровищ. И следующим важным триггером стала публикация на страницах туркестанского кружка статья Пославского, который был в 1898 году там и обнаружил якобы тайный ход подземный. Уже впоследствии, через 70 лет, выяснилось, что это остатки городской системы водоснабжения просто. Но это уже 70 лет прошло. Вот. Полномасштабное исследование уже началось, опять-таки, в 1969 году под руководством Кемаля Акишева. В 1965 году году, об этом Бустанов хорошо написал, Акишев, аргументируя научную значимость комплексного исследования ОТРАР, пишет в заявке, что существуют полулегендарные сведения о большой коллекции древних рукописей в ОТРАРе. Их число может достигать несколько десятков тысяч книг. Ссылки на источники, в том числе на предания, отсутствуют. Вот. Потом, после этого к ним приезжают, я уже ускоряюсь, журналисты Дозжан и Фомолов, авторы фантастических и исторических романов, значит, берут интервью и делают репортаж, 250 тысяч экземпляров, все это становится тотальным всесоюзным, вижу, значит, тотальным всесоюзным таким текстом, и вот внимательно надо прочитать, процитирую его, потому что он с тех пор утратил авторство и стал, так сказать, сакральным знанием. Вот они, что пишут в 1972 году. Древние хроники единодушно утверждают, что за столетия в Отрарской библиотеке были собраны тысячи и тысячи книг со всего света. Кипчакские летописи, обтянутые бараньими шкурами, арабские дастаны, книги, написанные на белой шагреневой коже, индийские своды, украшенные рыбьей чешуей, инжали мусульман, Евангелие христиан, стихи и рецепты лекарств, описание путешествий и так далее, и так далее. В общем, в дальнейшем текст описания библиотеки пережил вторичную фольклоризацию и полную утрату авторства. И с тех пор везде цитируется как источник древний. Вот. Значит, и потом он пошел-поехал уже, Ануар Альмжанов, Юрий Домбровский, во всех учебниках современного Казахстана, в энциклопедиях, в фильмах, интернете, везде, значит, все, оно превратилось в важное место памяти. Даже вот исследовательский центр Отрар Ктабханасы при Евразийском национальном университете был назван так, да, и концепция культурное наследие, там везде все это было. Вот. Вопрос, откуда взял Имашан в свое время и Акишев эту информацию? Ответ может быть найден только в одной единственной книге Кемаля Акишева 1972 года тоже, которая называется, значит, «Древний Отрар. Топография, стратиграфия, перспектива». Написано уже в соавторстве с Байпаковым и Ирзаковичем. Там он пишет: по некоторым сведениям можно предполагать, что в Отраре имелось свое книгохранилище. Так, по сообщению Рузбехана и Бинаи, в XV веке рукописи из Отрара доходили до города Сыгнака, где были переданы в дар Шайбани-хану. Вот эти два источника, которые называют, да, записки бухарского гостя и Шайбани-наме, вот там отсутствует эта информация, это, то есть, ложная цитата. Вот. Ну, значит, я заканчиваю, да, итоги подвожу. Это была генеалогия, мы описали генеалогию этого образа, которая стала тотальным местом исторической памяти. И почему? Почему вот так случилось, что вот эта искорка, она настолько стала популярной и тотальной. Все уровни, все нарративы ее подхватили, она там существует. Потому что, первое, как я уже говорил, проблема кочевого оседлого, прерывается кочевая культура и происходит рецепция археологического наследия. Второе, это, значит, хрущевская антирелигиозная кампания советского нацистстроительства. И, значит, один еще последний вот немаловажный фактор, балансирующий между причиной и следствием. В казахской культуре 60-х-70-х годов образ утраченной книги, утраченного просвещения становится одним из самых тотальных. Свою роль здесь сыграл советский нарратив и самоопределение СССР как самой читающей страны, в связке с утверждением, что именно советская власть даровала народам, освобожденным из империи, просвещение и всеобщую грамотность. И вот этот диссонанс, он вызывал протест, который выразился в частности вот в этом. То есть почва была самая подходящая, интеллигенции нужен был образ утраченного просвещения, и он был найден в утраченных книгах Отрарской библиотеки.
Спасибо, Игорь, за прекрасное выступление. И хочется поблагодарить вас за то, что вы в духе нашего вчерашнего вы процитировали наших академиков, да, Акишева и Байпакова и других против целью деконструкции. Но я считаю, что это тоже очень важная преемственность, исправлять ошибки предшественников. Так что спасибо вам за... Да. Мы еще не закончили. У нас еще есть discussant. Nargis Kassenova is a senior fellow and director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Regional Studies of KIMAP University. She is the former founder and director of the KIMAP Central Asian Studies Center and the China and Central Asia Studies Center.
Thank you.
Nargis,
Yeah, спасибо большое, Lima. Thank you very much. Well, Igor started with the honest statement saying that he will not finish on time. So I'll also start with the honest kind of statement that I'm not an expert in any of the areas, covered by the papers, but I enjoyed them a lot. I think all 4 papers are fascinating and very well argued. Well, as you noticed, it's a very broad range, right? The session gives us a very broad range of topics, but there are connections. Leora's and Igor's papers, they deal with the construction of identity and, well, the image construct of Atrar library or the alphabet, although alphabet is, like it's not just a cultural element, right? It's much more. It's a mega instrument that help to foster new political reality. And the papers of Keres, Alexei, Gavin, and the third co-author. So, but she's not here, so I'll just mention you. They deal with the governance, with strategizing of stakeholders. So there are these kind of connections between. There are kind of 2 sets of papers in this regard. But let me start with Leora's paper, and I'll be very brief. I'll just say what I can, kind of maybe a little bit make comments that are a little bit out of the box because I'm not really an expert in these areas. So Leora talks about the tropes and use of words. So I'll do that as well. I'll focus on the words. You describe Latinization as, well, you quote people, right, describing Latinization as revolution, as revolt, as loss, and as a creation. The word create, like sort of is used many times, comes a lot throughout the text. The word that came to my mind, it was not used in your paper, is disruption. There is one disruption of the political order that I saw at the end, but you use the word shift. But it's sort of striking how many shifts we've had over a relatively short period of time. And I was wondering what this frequency of shifts, frequency of disruptions tells about us, about Kazakhstan, about Central Asia, maybe sort of this periphery or place in between, and whether this Latinization that we are doing now would anchor us somewhere or not in your view. Igor's okay, let me go to Igor's paper. So Igor, extremely interesting. So you focus on the ways that Kazakh intelligentsia constructed identity and placed Kazakhs in the context of the world history, in the story of the Enlightenment, and the kind of and there is this connection between the construct of the Atrar library and nation-state genesis, and this takes place during the 60s and 70s. And I'm wondering if we can add to that. So we have this connection between the construct and nation-state building, which I think the really fascinating period, like really 70s, 80s, super interesting. But there was another trend, in the 60s, 70s taking place, and you actually maybe not focus on it, but definitely there are there are references to it, is the popularization of science, popularization of knowledge that takes place in the 60s and the 70s. That's when during the ottipil, the thaw, right, at the we see the kind of the blooming of общество знания, yeah, the society knowledge that I'm sure everybody here knows. There is an expansion of the organization. There is the expansion of people involved in these activities, and these lecturers of the общество знания, they go around and they popularize knowledge and science. But what we see, is not just the popularization of science, but also the proliferation of conspiracy theories and myths, right? That these actually общество знания people are, kind of start constructing and start spreading, and that's when the kind of this. Conspiracies about UFOs, emerged, but the Otrar library kind of, construct, I think also is one case, right? Where did it come from, this knowledge, right? And this knowledge. So I was wondering what you kind of think about that. And okay, the paper, Karas's paper, really. Super interesting. All papers were super interesting. It was really, I think I was very fortunate to be assigned to this session. I'm not sure how fortunate you are, but anyhow, I think the insight you leave us with about the sort of complexity of the field within which migration data, migration control, sort of looks to recognize seemingly contradicting thrusts as opposed to focusing on contradictions as evidence of bad policy. I think it's a very important insight. I'm very much in favor of seeing complexity and understanding the complexity of the authoritarian systems, and that's what your paper does as well. But my question is not actually linked to this, to the labor migrants, but I was wondering what kind of manipulations do you see, if there are manipulations with the data on people leaving Russia now? Are we going to see any strategizing there? So, and the paper on downsizing, also extremely interesting, and I love this emphasis on meso and micro levels. I think that's where the meat is. But let me go to the macro level, and well, you discussed this humanization, right? Humanization of the penitentiary system. And you describe Kazakhstan as a successful case of the external normative pressures, right? That Kazakhstan wanted to fit in, it wanted to have good ratings, and then, well, the elites strategized, right? They focused on easy targets, and that's what this authoritarian downsizing is about. And we definitely see the same strategies in other areas of reforms. So I think it's great that kind of you really exposed how it works. Taking the penitentiary system. And I wanted to kind of connect it to what's happening today. Well, one of the constitutional amendments to be adopted, put on referendum now, is the ban on the death sentence, which sort of shows that this humanization gets solidified, right? So And I would think the external kind of, the external factor, right, the pull factors, push and pull factors, right, play an important role in that. But how do you explain that some small, and it makes sense for a small state to do that, yeah, to try to fit. Why some small states do it while others don't? I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you. I hope I haven't forgotten.
Thank you, Nargis, and we're doing great on time. We are at 4:11, and this panel is supposed to end at 4:30, and we started 5 minutes late, so we can end at 5:35. And I want to use my chair rights and reward the audience for having been patient and open the floor to questions. And while you answer, also we gather questions, and then you can answer Nargis's questions as well.
Hi, I'm Simon Pawley from British Management University in Tashkent. I have a question for Leora. Thank you very much for the fascinating paper. One of the things that's very noticeable in Uzbekistan is that Latinization is a very long, slow, gradual process. Almost all government documents are still written in Cyrillic. So the question that I had basically was, you know, the language that you're talking about is very vivid about rupture. It sounds like very sudden changes, like an urgent crisis. Can you talk about like how that kind of language fits with the fact that Latinization itself is actually a very slow, gradual thing? Thank you.
Hi, yes, so thank you for your great presentations. I have a question to Leora Eisenberg. When you talked about the decision to switch from Kazakh to Latin alphabet and the response by Russian media, you talked a lot about the ideas of that switch would affect the use, for instance, of Russian language supposedly, and its purpose to serve as sort of like language of communication in Kazakhstan. Yeah. However, my question is, do you think that that switch and response that we see in Russian media has something to do with the post-Soviet nostalgia that exists? And for instance, Timur Dadabayev, in his recent book, he wrote about it. And if you know this book, he talks about two types of nostalgia: reflective and restorative. And do you think this response serves as restorative or maybe reflective nostalgia? So, and I have a question to Gavin Slade. Thank you for your great presentation. So it's interesting that you know that you see signs of possible authoritarian downsizing. However, as you know, that there has been a lot of literature on authoritarian deepening in our region. So would you say, how would you reconcile that on one hand you have authoritarian deepening in Kazakhstan and the rise of network authoritarianism, but at the same time you see, or you argue that there is authoritarian downsizing, or maybe it's not authoritarian downsizing. So thank you.
I go the next, right? Should I? Yeah. Oh, okay. Then I got a question for Gavin. So I was wondering if they still use military units to guard prisons, as they did in the USSR. And like the next question would be, does this somehow overlap with that MVD police identity, and maybe police just wants to, you know, write the penal system of its books altogether and handle it to the army? This sort of question, just trying to understand the institutional background of this whole reform. And I also got a question to Leora. So I was wondering if there were any Russian media that actually evaluated the reform positively. And relatedly, have you noticed maybe some sort of correlations between like media's political alignment and, so to say, and the profile of tropes it deploys? So could we say, for example, that liberal media were more likely to utilize this particular trope and conservative media is more about like that particular trope, something like that? So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for great presentations. My name is Agbota Karibaeva. I'm with the George Washington University. I have a question for Leora and for Alexei and Gavin. So for Leora, and this kind of echoes what Nargis said about the frequency of shifts or the ruptures, disruptions. I mean, I wonder, and I know this is not your main question, but if you have an opinion on why the switch is happening now from the Cyrillic to Latin, and I know it's been circulating for a while now with the government, but why the actual actions have been started taking place really recently. Is it a matter of capacity? Is it a matter of political will? If there's anything else that's going on that's beyond the domestic politics, the foreign policy, or if it does, like to what extent does it matter? And to Alexei and Gavin, I had a question about alternative explanations. I haven't seen your paper, but I'm curious how you rule out other empirically rule out other alternative explanations, like what if the crime rate actually in reality goes down and that drives the incarceration rate down, kind of like that. Yeah, thank you.
That's my question to Ms. Leora. Thank you for your interesting presentation. My name is Sanya. I'm a senior year student of the journalism faculty. And I do believe that analyzing fundraising sources while analyzing mass media outlets is a cornerstone for every mass media outlets analysis. And I do believe that RT, Izvestia, and Land.ru are under the Russian state authorities' control. And my question is, have you analyzed mass media outlets that are not under the control of the Russian state authorities, are so-called independent media? Thank you.
Thank you. That was the last question, and we answer in the order of presentations with Leora starting and then continue to carry on further.
I didn't expect to get 5 questions, so I'll try to answer everybody. The first question is from the gentleman in the back about the duration, how long Latinization takes and whether or not that affects how it's covered in the media. I think I wrote down on my paper, the Russian media is uninterested in how long it takes until it takes a long time, which is to say they're only interested in how long it takes when it makes the country that does it look bad, which is why you saw in the Eurasia Daily article that I covered, Dastan Yildizev specifically talks about how badly it was implemented in Uzbekistan. The second question was, do I think that the Kazakh Latin shift is related to nostalgia from the gentleman over there in the white shirt? Was it restorative or reflective? And I think it's very much, I had to look up those terms, by the way, after you spoke. I think it is reflective. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so concerned. Right? And when I looked it up, it's a reflection of the best days are behind us. It's negative, not positive. And I think it's exactly what's going on. You're not concerned about something if you're confident in its further life beyond the trope, the Soviet era. The third question was about positive coverage and the political leaning of the media affecting the coverage, which is related to Alia's question. There has been some neutral kind of tending positive coverage in Kommersant, for example, which is not a state-owned publication. I should have made that caveat at the beginning. I don't talk about that. I largely focused on state-owned media, which obviously I realize makes a big difference in the kind of tenor of my presentation. And in question 4, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, from GW, the frequency of the shifts and why is the shift happening now? I'm not a political scientist, so it's hard for me to say exactly, but I think the main, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but the kind of main impulse toward the language shift, alphabet shift happened in 2017, kind of late 2010s. And my guess is that that's happening because, I said that scripts are symbolic, right? I don't have to rehash that. But I think it started happening a lot after Crimea because there was discussion of language shifts. Even in the 90s, there were conferences in Turkey, right? This wasn't a new idea. And I think now it will pick up speed, especially because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's really hard to go back to Cyrillic now that Kazakhstan is aware of the political climate. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, to Nargis's question about how we can potentially see parallels in what's going on with data now, I think it's the right question to ask in terms of how do these sorts of theoretical ways of thinking about data and data production, how do they transfer to other kind of categories? And we're also looking through these kind of lenses at COVID data in Kazakhstan and Russia. So that's, you know, and they transfer really well, actually. But I think, you know, one thing that's interesting about the data on Russians leaving Russia is that certainly, so it's like the FSB that does border statistics in Russia, and they are producing the data. But I'm not sure, I mean, there's data and there's data rhetoric, right? There's the data and then there's how the data is framed in the media. And I haven't really seen a lot of framings of how that's being kind of portrayed in the Russian media, though it's really being, you know, the rhetoric is really strong and important in Kazakhstan about Russians coming and why they're coming and what the data means. But I think what another layer that's interesting is that when you're dealing with migration data, it's not only, now we're not only dealing with Russian data, we're also dealing with Kazakhstani data. And one figure that you hear kind of bandied about a lot is how many EENs have been distributed in the last, you know, since February 24th. And then there's multiple rhetorics, multiple stories that get, you know, kind of elaborated to explain that, right? Oh, that means, you know, there's actual Russians coming and they're establishing a sort of presence, or that people here are opening EENs for their friends in Russia so that they can have some sort of financial, international financial access, right? Those are two different competing stories that are being kind of put out, and they're in the media that uses the same data but uses different explanations. So I think you can kind of, you know, think about that same sort of explanatory frameworks using, you know, very different data categories. Yeah.
So on the Kazakh side, do you think it's more like, what's the strategy to give more data sort of, or, you know?
Well, that's very rarely the Kazakhstani strategy. I mean, and for the past, you know, 10 years, I've compared Russia data and Kazakhstan data, and Kazakhstani data is usually just so much more hidden, right? Yeah, compared to the Russian data, there's just ample Russian data, and usually maybe just one or two figures that come in Kazakhstan, and they're very difficult to systematize over years and across categories and things like that. It's kind of, it's much more difficult. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. They're really interesting. So Nargis, yeah, I mean, basically that's one of our ideas, is to try to, you know, test the theory. Okay, so where do we see cases where you don't have this type of downsizing, penal downsizing? So the question about small states that don't do this type of thing. So if we were trying to do a comparative case study, if we're looking at more similar cases, I mean, Turkmenistan is a good example where you don't see downsizing. You've seen it in Uzbekistan, as I say, in Belarus, in Russia, but not in Turkmenistan. So, I mean, we have a theory about that. I mean, which is that one of the assumptions doesn't hold in terms of the theory, which is that you care about your image internationally. We suppose that maybe Turkmenistan is not so vulnerable to those things that you mentioned, the external normative pressures. Possibly that might be the way to explain it, but it's certainly there for a comparative case study, basically, to try to understand the variation. And then I think, so a couple of the other questions, I think that's my own fault for just not being a bit clearer with language. So, I mean, when I talk about authoritarian downsizing, I'm just excluding the word penal, authoritarian penal downsizing, right? So, yeah. I mean, the puzzle actually is that authoritarian regimes are deepening at the same time as the prison population is decreasing, and how do you explain that? I think, again, if you pick apart the actual prison statistics, and you can see certain groups where you still have this targeting of certain groups, and those certain groups are still being incarcerated. As I said, the use of the extremism articles and terrorism articles are particularly important, I think, for seeing the relationship between authoritarianism and penal policy. And to the other points, I think, Alexei, perhaps you could answer this. I mean, so to Darkan's question about militarization, I think that's also just a confusion in terms of, you know, in the MVD thinking about military, you know, that people who have military rank, not necessarily that they're from the army. The army is used occasionally for policing prisons, but yeah, like I said, you are.
Yeah, I mean, for policing prisons, only when there's a riot in the prison, they bring in OMON from MVD, but they don't bring military units. Sorry, I was just
In the Soviet Union, they were using military units.
Well, they were called the
and they no
internal
longer do
troops,
that.
internal troops of MVD.
Mhm.
Yeah. So now
okay.
it's National Guard, but now
Mhm.
in Kazakhstan it's OMON that's used only for
okay.
riots and for enforcement sometimes when prison guards are corrupt, so you cannot trust them to do the proper shmon. So you have to delegate. But the broader point is that reduction. Downsizing of authoritarian downsizing. So we had Soviet Union, which was responsible for everything. State was responsible. Regime was responsible for everything. Now, if you look, we have forest fires in many parts of Russia and Kazakhstan because it was the forestry service was downsized. There was simply no forestry experts protecting and preventing. Healthcare, you can look. In rural areas in Russia, there are villages without a single pharmacy. So in the Soviet Union, so anyway, there is a downsizing of responsibility. So for prison chiefs, they did not downsize the number of prison guards. Yeah, but they reduce them. So one alternative explanation would be, well, all these countries are ruled by kleptocrats, so they don't want to go to prisons. So they downsize, so for sure they don't go and their cronies don't go to prison. So that alternative explanation, I mean, we need to maybe study more.
Yeah, I mean, just on the question about crime rates, of course, I mean, it reminds me of a joke from The Simpsons, which is crime has been reduced since we legalized it. I mean, obviously, what is criminal is a political decision, how you punish, whether it's an administrative offence or whether it's an offence that will see you go to prison, it's a felony or not. So actually, so our research suggests that crime rates have not decreased in any way in Kazakhstan. There's a huge latent crime rate. It's about 5 times more than the actual official statistics. Contact rates, arrest rates have maintained themselves. So we're still seeing an active criminal justice system. It's just how they're being processed, those cases. And I left that out because of time, but Alexei's written a lot about that, the sort of mechanisms through which people are processed through the criminal justice system. And they've been diverted from the prison system, they've been diverted out from outside, which all suggests a political process. Basically, decisions are being made about that.
Я отвечаю на вопрос Наргиз Касеновой. Вот вы вспомнили, да, про 70-е годы и как бы задались вопросом, откуда берутся вот эти мифы, теории заговора, НЛО. И я вспомнил песню Высоцкого 77-го года «Канатчикова дача», где он говорит: уважаемый редактор, может лучше про реактор, про любимый лунный трактор, ведь нельзя же год подряд то тарелками пугают, дескать, подлые летают, то у вас собаки лают, то руины говорят. И действительно, вот это, видимо, тогда такая тема была. Но почему? Просто, давайте как бы признаемся себе, что более привлекательно. Вот, допустим, вот 2 двери, если в одну дверь забежит охранник с криком, что на территории Назарбаев университета увидели НЛО, а с другой дверь забежит охранник с криком на территории Назарбаев университета лекция по астрофизике. Куда мы побежим? Конечно, в первую дверь. Вот. Поэтому это очевидно, мне кажется. Вот. А что касается... вот профессор Абулхошин абсолютно прав, когда говорит, что массовое сознание советское характеризует его как определенную модификацию модернизированной архаики, модернизированного, как он говорит, аграрно-традиционного. Вот. И можно тут также слово «мимесис» использовать, да? Один из базовых когнитивных алгоритмов воспроизводства традиционной культуры, ставшей основой многих культур и идеологий, несмотря на декларированный ими модернистский пафос. Вот. И социокультурная природа СССР, как он справедливо говорит, была модернизирована ровно в том смысле, что создала новый мимесис. Вот. Поэтому мифы, фольклор и так далее – это основа нашего мышления, основа основ. Вот, так что вот так вот.
Why? So we have finished before. Oh, yeah.
Well, this is it's almost it. You know, this is our sixth panel, the ultimate panel is over, but the conference is, well, still not. We still have to make few final remarks to and to call it at least officially over. Really, what intense and vertiginous 2 days this were for me, for sure. I mean, spatially, we moved from Russia to Central Asia, to Ukraine, and to Poland. Chronologically, from the deep mythological past, right, through early modern times and Muscovy, all the way to well, to this very present moment, right, and of course with some sort of gesture, you know, towards the happy utopian future that is awaiting us. And also, of course, we have explored, since this was a conference also about knowledge in many of its manifestations, as art, as religion, as science, and also as pseudoscience. So really, at the same time, thanks to our great moderators and discussants, and thanks to Alexander Vakru, who is not there, and Professor Martin, I think we, despite the very multifaceted nature of the presentations made, I think we succeeded in maintaining the kind of the essential, the core unity. We haven't lost it. So a lot of really a lot of food for thought. Of course, you could understand that I personally, again, at this moment, feel a little bit mentally drained, rather a bit vacuous. But I think, right? But I personally do think I see the silver lining to this, right? So now the middle space is vacated, so you know, for what? For the reflection over the material that we have all received here. So I'm sure I'll have now a row of sleepless nights, and those sleepless nights would have nothing to do with the fact that this conference, with the organizational aspects of this conference. So good. Now, speaking of the organization, this is the moment where I would like to thank all the people who were involved in making this conference happen. And I'd like to, of course, start by thanking our top management of the Nazarbayev University, right, without whose moral and material support, of course, this this conference would have not been what it is. I would like to thank our Harvard partners who brought a stellar team of experts, and thanks to whom our conference had graduated from that of international to that of intercontinental. So we're looking forward for something interstellar probably next time. I would like to thank our Kazakhstani colleagues who came from, well, actually from all places in Kazakhstan, right? From different parts of Kazakhstan, and also from Nur-Sultan for their again insightful presentations, and of course for their ENU, Al-Farabi University, Karaganda, Kostanay. Thank you, you'll do it. And for the interests, right? So now we are waiting now to be invited by you, right? So looking forward. Of course, our panelists, my gratitude is illimitable. I mean, truly, and I think that really goes without saying that panelists are the people who shape the content of the events like that. I'd like to thank all the guests and for their questions, guests present here